This week in wrestling history, 57 years ago this week, on December 15th, 1963, Rikidozan, widely considered the father of Japanese pro wrestling, died at the age of 39, 1 week after being stabbed in a fight in a nightclub by a member of the Yakuza, or at least a branch of the Yakuza. The father of Japanese wrestling was actually Korean-born. He moved to Japan to become a sumo, and after he retired, he got into pro wrestling. Antonio Inoki, Giant Baba, Hiro Matsuda were all students of his. He was a gigantic cultural icon in Japan, a huge celebrity. Everybody over there at that time knew who Rikidozan was. And for all of his success and all of his notoriety, he was also a businessman who got involved with some very shady individuals. And he was also known to be a mean drunk. And boy, did he drink. At the club that night, a young Yakuza member ran into him near the men's room, which led to an argument and the stabbing. The cops were called, and here is a brief court transcript of what happened that night from the book Japan, the Rikidozan Years. It says about 11:10 p.m., Rikidozan was talking with the club hostess when Murata, which was the guy's last name, when Murata pushed past them, Rikidozan said, "Hey, you bastard, you stepped on my foot." Murata denied the charge but admitted, "My shoulder may have touched yours. You're a big man, and it couldn't be helped in such a narrow space." What a polite man. Rikidozan, who had been drinking quite heavily, got angry. He shoved Murata, kicked him in the abdomen, and knocked him down. He sat astride the accused and struck him on the head relentlessly. Murata pulled out a mountain knife, over 5 inches in length, and stabbed Rikidozan in the left side of his abdomen. Holding his bleeding belly, Rikidozan went up onto the stage and, using the microphone, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, be careful. There's a killer in this club. You'd better go home right away." So he went to go see a surgeon. He didn't really want to draw a lot of attention, though, so he went to an obstetrics and gynecology hospital that was near his home. His wounds were not thought to be life-threatening. He had successful surgery. The problem is that as soon as he got home that same day, he started drinking again, which is not what you're supposed to be doing. And a week later, his condition worsened. He had to go back in for a second operation, which also was a success. But he developed a condition called peritonitis, and he died. 12,000 people. That was the estimate of the number of people that attended his funeral. So when I tell you that he was a huge cultural icon in Japan at that time, I mean, there it is. 12,000. I think if you combine the total number of people that will be at the funeral for every single person listening to this clip right now and forevermore, we will not come close to 12,000 people at any of our funerals. But the man who stabbed him was found guilty of murder. He served 8 years in prison. When he got out, he visited Rikidozan's grave every year on the day of his death. And every year before he went to go visit the gravesite, he would call Rikidozan's children and apologize for what he had done. And WWE inducted him into the legacy wing of their Hall of Fame in 2017. Rikidozan was not the only major international star to pass away this week in history. 20 years ago, Lucha Libre legend Blue Demon died of a heart attack on a park bench after his morning training session at 78 years old. So still working out right up until the very end. 25 years ago this week, on December 17, 1995, WWE presented its 5th In Your House pay-per-view, Seasons Beatings. Jeff Jarrett made his return after walking out on the company 5 months earlier, and he announced his plans to enter the 1996 Royal Rumble match, which never happened. Instead, he wrestled Ahmed Johnson on that show. So I don't know what he did to deserve that punishment. But that was his role on the show. And then after that, he was out with a back injury for the rest of the year until he signed with WCW. So he came back to WWE. He literally was back for all of a month and a half, and that was it. He didn't wrestle again for WWE until, what was it, the end of 97, beginning of 98. Dean Douglas was scheduled on this night to wrestle Ahmed Johnson, but he claimed a back injury, and that sent WWE scrambling for an opponent at the last minute, which turned out to be the Nature Boy, Buddy Landel. Not that Nature Boy, a different Nature Boy. Buddy Landel, who was basically doing the company a solid by stepping up to do the job, which he did very quickly. It was a quick match. The company was going to reward him by offering him a spot on the roster. Landel was a Ric Flair clone, and I don't say that as an insult because, by all accounts, Buddy Landel was a pretty damn good wrestler. You know, he actually, one of the better matches he ever had was a match that year in the summer of 95. I think it was in Smoky Mountain against Shawn Michaels for the Intercontinental title. That might have even been the match that really got him on WWE's radar. But he was a Ric Flair clone from the Nature Boy name, which even Flair took. I mean, before Ric Flair, there was Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. So it's not like Ric Flair came up with that name either. But he had the Flair hair, and he wore a robe like Flair. He even used Flair's old WWF theme music. At the TV tapings that followed this show, he had a few matches, including a WWF title match against Bret Hart that he lost. But the next day, so after that taping, there was another one the next day. I don't remember where they were, but wherever they were, there was a blizzard outside. So he had blizzard conditions. He wrestled a young Matt Hardy that night, got a win. And unfortunately for him, as his WWE career was about to really get going, he slipped on a patch of ice, leaving the arena that night, and he broke his ankle and had to go have surgery, and he ended up being out for like six or 8 weeks. But that was it. He never came back. That was the end of his brief run in WWE until a few years later he had, I don't know if it was a tryout match or what it was, I think on one of the syndicated shows. It was like one match, I think, against Triple H. And that was about it. But Balls Mahoney made his WWE debut on this night, working for Ted DiBiase as the evil Santa Claus. Santa Claus's evil twin, I guess. Santa Claus was from the North Pole, Santa Claus was from the South Pole. And he attacked Savio Vega, who, if I remember correctly, was, I think, giving out, he was reaching into his giant sack and giving gifts out, throwing gifts out to the crowd before he was attacked by Santa Claus. Or maybe Santa Claus was giving the gifts out, and then as he went after DiBiase, I think he whacked him with his sack. Something like that. Triple H won an Arkansas hogped match against the hog farmer himself, Henry O. Godwin, and got his back sliced open pretty good on the gate to the hog pen, which made me wince when the match was over. Because you knew Triple H, right? The pretty boy, preppy boy. He was going to end up in the mud and the slop and the shit, and he did. Got press slammed, face down, but then he got body slammed into all that shit and all that mud with an open wound, an open bloody gash on his back. And even then, I remember watching that just going, man, this guy's going to get infected. Hopefully that didn't happen. Undertaker beat King Mabel in a casket match. This was during his Phantom of the Opera mask phase after Mabel legitimately crushed his orbital socket. It was not as I think they told you on TV because Mabel gave him a leg drop. It was at a live event. They were working together at a live event. I think what happened was he either shot Undertaker into the ropes and he was going for a clothesline, but I think Undertaker was too far away and his fist went right into the Undertaker's eye and crushed his orbital socket. And so Undertaker, when he came back, had to wear this special mask to protect his face, and I always just looked at it and said, I mean, it wasn't really the half mask, but it just, for whatever reason, it reminded me of the Phantom of the Opera. So I always look at that as the Phantom of the Opera phase for The Undertaker. 1995 was a dreadful year for The Undertaker. These were his opponents on pay-per-view. I've made a list. These were his opponents on pay-per-view in 1995. Erwin R. Shyster, King Kong Bundy, Mabel, Kama, who I know is his best friend, so I'm sure he loved working with him. He was on a Survivor Series team against Triple H, Jerry Lawler, Isaac Yankem, and King Mabel, and then a casket match with Mabel. This poor fucker had to work Mabel, what was that, 3 times on pay-per-view in 95, and he got his face caved in for it. And in the main event, the only thing that really matters on the... Actually, this In Your House was not a terrible show. This was not one of the worst In Your House shows. But this show is really remembered for the main event. And that was Bret Hart retaining the WWF Championship over the British Bulldog in a rematch from their SummerSlam Classic at Wembley Stadium. I like this match better than the Wembley one. I think this is a better match than the one they had at Wembley Stadium. And much bloodier, too, which is something that was a no-no during that period in WWE. You did not blade. You did not bleed, you did not blade at that time in WWE. And Bret Hart has a history of getting away with this. He got away with it at WrestleMania 8. You weren't allowed to blade then either, and he did. And then Ric Flair did, although Ric Flair didn't really do a very good job of hiding it. And there's the famous story at Mania after that great match with Randy Savage. Flair goes to the back, and Vince McMahon was all disappointed, and he made some kind of comment to Flair. What was the exact? It was like 1 step forward, 2 steps back, or it was something along those lines. He was very disappointed, and he fined Flair for doing that. Bret Hart did not get punished because Bret Hart was able to convince people, even though it was total bullshit, as he admitted in his book. But he convinced everybody that he got busted open in his match with Piper hard way. So he didn't get punished. And guess what? He didn't get punished here either. He told the story in his book that on his way to the building, he was trying to come up with something. He and the Bulldog were trying to come up, and really it was Bret, because Bret said the Bulldog basically just let Bret figure everything out. Bulldog was not very helpful in planning for this match. And they were just kind of thrown together. So you have the story of, okay, these two guys are brother-in-law or brothers-in-law. And yes, they had that famous match at SummerSlam, but it was just sort of thrown together. And Bret was trying to come up with a way to really heat the match up. On his way to the building, he claims that as he's driving along, he drove past a pharmacy. He saw a sign for a pharmacy. And so he went in and he bought a razor blade and some scissors. And he cut himself right along the top of his hairline during the match, because there's a spot where Bulldog knocks him into the ring steps. And somewhere in there is where he cut himself. And he made it look like hard way. Even when he got to the back, when the match was over, the commission doctor that night, I think they were in Hershey Park, and the commission doctor, when the match was over, said, well, the cut was from the ring steps. And so that was it. Bret didn't get punished. 2 days prior to this show, these two guys had a dry run of their pay-per-view match. 2 days before, they wrestled at the Stu Hart 50th anniversary show up in Calgary. I assume that's 50th anniversary of him becoming a promoter and not his 50th birthday. I think even in 1995, Stu Hart he looked like he was 75 years old. But it was some kind of Stu Hart anniversary show. They were wrestling. And Chris Jericho was also, I don't think he was on the card, but he was backstage at the show that night. And Jericho was still pretty new to the business. I mean, he had only been wrestling at that point for about 5 years, right? Debuted in 1990. Had not yet reached the big time. He had not yet, I don't think, had yet appeared in ECW, and he wasn't in WCW and wasn't in WWE, obviously. But he was there, and as he tells the story, he overheard Bret and Bulldog planning some things out for their In Your House match. And he overheard Bret say that he was having trouble coming up with a finish, because I guess he didn't want to use the sharpshooter, or maybe they told him, no sharpshooter, we don't want Bulldog submitting. Whatever the case, he was having a difficult time trying to come up with a unique finish for the match. I mean, if you think about it, the Wembley match also had a unique pinfall finish. There was no submission. Even the Bulldog didn't use his running power slam. Well, Jericho overheard this. And Jericho suggested using a La Magistral cradle, which he had learned during his time in Mexico. And Bret had him demonstrate the move for him. And he did. And after that, Jericho really didn't think anything of it until 2 days later when he's watching the pay-per-view. And what does he see? He sees Bret Hart. Not only is he using the move that Jericho showed him 2 days earlier, he wins the fucking match with it. So, again, imagine if you're somebody like Chris Jericho who probably looks up to Bret Hart. You're still brand new to the business. This guy took your suggestion, and that was the finish of a pay-per-view match for the World Championship. And he said he was always amazed that Bret would take a suggestion like that from a rookie. The very next day, Alundra Blaze, who was the reigning WWF Women's Champion at the time, when her contract was allowed to expire 1 week earlier, that was when Vince McMahon made the decision to abandon the women's division. She shocked the world and the WWF when she walked out on WCW Monday Nitro with the women's title and dropped it in a trash can on live TV. This was the second shot fired in the Monday Night War, at least as far as I'm concerned. This was the second shot fired in the Monday Night War. The first one being the shock debut of Lex Luger. On the very first episode of Monday Nitro, Luger works a WWF house show one night, shows up at the Mall of America the next. I'd call that pretty shocking. So this was shot number 2. She said that she was now going by her old Madusa name. She used to be Alundra Blaze. Now she's Madusa again. She said WCW is where the big boys play, and now it's where the big girls play. Now, there had been plans for an Alundra Blaze title defense at the Royal Rumble in '96 against Aja Kong. They were bringing in some women at that time from Japan. Aja Kong was one of them. And apparently the early plans had that being a match. Aja Kong was probably going to win the title and probably defend it, overseas in Japan. That did not happen. That went out the window when they made the call to just give up on the women. And J.J. Dillon, who was working for Vince McMahon at the time, supposedly either mailed or faxed, probably mailed, a letter over to Alundra Blaze to let her know basically that she was fired. They were not going to renew her contract and that she was fired. She still has a copy of the letter at home. She had not even been fired a full 24 hours when she got a phone call from Eric Bischoff asking if she was interested in coming back to WCW. And, of course, she said she was, and they had been friends going back to the AWA days, so they had a rapport, and he was like, great. He says, by the way, do you still have that belt? And she said, what, yeah, I still have it. Why? And Bischoff said, bring it to Nitro on Monday. And then he shared his idea with her about what he wanted her to do. So it was Eric Bischoff's idea. She went along with it, but it was Eric Bischoff's idea. She insisted, though, look, I need to have the belt back when the angle is over because it's not mine. It belongs to Vince. I got to return it to Vince. Bischoff said, sure, no problem. We'll make sure we get it back to you. And they did. After the angle, somebody brought it to her in the locker room, and she got the belt back. I don't know what happened because she still had possession of the belt, at least up until a few years ago when she went into the Hall of Fame. She still might have it. I don't know if she gave it to WWE. Maybe that'll end up in their eventual physical Hall of Fame. But she ended up keeping the belt. I mean, there's an old tweet from, 5, 6, 7 years ago. I think she tweeted Beth Phoenix at the time. She was like teasing a match. And it was her at home posing with the title around her waist. So she never did give it back to them. Maybe they didn't want it from her. Maybe they were so pissed at her, they just, basically told her to fuck off. I don't know. But Vince McMahon was said to have learned about the angle from a technician early on during the live Raw show that night, and he was said to be stunned. This was a woman. You gotta remember something here, and she told this story herself. This is a woman who ended up flat broke and homeless. She was homeless for a year. Or the year before she first signed with WWE, she ended up broke and homeless. She was living in her car, and then her car got repossessed. So she was on the street. And she had racked up about $80,000 in debt that she owed to the IRS. And then one day, she got a call from Vince McMahon to see if she was interested in coming to work for the WWF. And he hired her. Now, of course, I hear this story, how one gets a phone call from Vince McMahon when they're living on the street, and this was back during a time with no cell phones. That is a mystery to me. But this is the story that she told JBL on JBL's old Legends with JBL show on the network. So when Vince McMahon asked, look, is there anything you need help with? Do you need help with anything? She said, yeah, you can help me pay this IRS bill. I assume she must have said it, like in a joking or at least a half-joking way. And Vince asked her, okay, well, how much are you in debt for? And she said, $80,000. I don't think she expected anything to come from it. But she says the next day she got a check from Vince McMahon in the amount of $80,000 to pay off her IRS bill. And she repaid him by taking his belt and throwing it in the trash can on a competitor's show. So you can see why Vince McMahon would probably keep his guard up and maybe not have as much trust in people as he once did. Remember, the year before this, Randy Savage, in his mind, had betrayed him by walking out and going to WCW. Then something like this happens. That one angle got her blackballed from WWE for the next 20 years until they finally inducted her into their Hall of Fame in 2015. And it probably had a lot to do with that finish to the main event at the Survivor Series in 1997. 23 years ago this week, on December 15th, 1997, Bret Hart, speak of the devil, made his WCW debut on Monday Nitro, 5 weeks removed from one of the most infamous matches in wrestling history. And what was his role? He was announced as the guest referee for the Starrcade match between Eric Bischoff and Larry Zbyszko. And referee that match he did. But he also came back out at the end of Starrcade that night, and he ended up punching, it was Nick Patrick, I think, referee Nick Patrick, in the face for what he claimed was a fast 3 count. So Bret comes out, he grabs Nick Patrick. This was after Hogan cleanly pinned Sting with a leg drop. Nick Patrick was supposed to fast count. He didn't. Why he didn't, we'll never know. We can speculate on why. I think we all probably know why. But he did not fast count. Sting looked like an idiot. All this build-up for that. But here comes Bret Hart to save the day, and you're just watching this thinking, well, what are you doing? The referee didn't do anything wrong. But Bret Hart says, he had mouthed something to Nick Patrick about, there's not going to be another screw job here or something. Punch the guy in the face. I think Bret Hart was still all amped up after punching Vince McMahon in the face a few weeks earlier. He just wanted to go around punching people. I mean, can you blame him after what happened to him? Some people smash their video game controllers when they get really angry, and Bret Hart goes around punching people in the face. You say tomato, I say tomato. That very same night, over on the USA Network, Vince McMahon announced a major change in WWE's creative direction in a speech on WWE's own YouTube channel that they titled Mr. McMahon Ushers in the Attitude Era. The Attitude Era was already in full effect. It did usher in the scratch logo, though. This was the first Raw to have the Attitude Era scratch logo in the corner of the screen. Among the things that Vince talked about was making an effort to entertain us in a more contemporary manner. We in the WWF think that you, the audience, are quite frankly tired of having your intelligence insulted. We also think that you're tired of the same old simplistic theory of good guys versus bad guys. Surely the era of the superhero urging you to say your prayers and take your vitamins is definitely passé. Therefore, we've embarked on a far more innovative and contemporary creative campaign that is far more invigorating and extemporaneous than ever before. He loves using those big words, doesn't he? He sure does. Through some 50 years, the World Wrestling Federation has been an entertainment mainstay here in North America and all over the world. One of the reasons for that longevity is, as the times have changed, so have we. I'm happy to say that this new vibrant creative direction has resulted in a huge increase in television viewership, for which we thank the USA Network and TSN for allowing us to have the creative freedom. Well, if 2020 Vince McMahon would listen to 1997 Vince McMahon, then the product would be better off. That doesn't mean bring back Vince Russo. It means writing television that doesn't drive away viewers and record numbers. WWE insults its audience on a weekly basis, and they should be ashamed of the product that they put on television every Monday night. 21 years ago this week, on December 19th, 1999, the night of Goldberg's fateful mule kick at Starrcade that concussed Bret Hart so badly it went undiagnosed for weeks and ultimately ended his career. So what WCW tried to do here, what Vince Russo tried to do here, was recreate the Montreal Screwjob finish. There's something we've never seen before. With Bret Hart locking Goldberg in the sharpshooter, Roddy Piper, who came down and ended up being the referee for the match, calling for the bell, even though Goldberg obviously did not submit. Bret Hart looked confused, the fans were confused. A lot of people had confused looks on their faces when it came to WCW booking during this period. But the idea, I guess, is that Vince Russo told Piper to give the win to Bret as a way to make up for what happened to him in Montreal. This entire pay-per-view was Russo at his worst. 2.5 years later, Bret was riding his bicycle when he hit a pothole. And he flew over the handlebars and he landed on the back of his head. He suffered a stroke. Did the concussion at this show have anything to do with him having a stroke? When, he had the impact, he had the accident, and did the concussion have anything to do with that? Who knows? I'm not a doctor. I don't know. I don't know if Bret was ever told that it did or not. Maybe he mentioned it in his book. I don't recall. But without that stroke, a lot of things would have turned out very differently. And we probably would have ended up with some great dream matches with Bret back in WWE. I guarantee you he would have been back in WWE a lot sooner than he was. I think a match with Shawn Michaels would have been a given. Imagine that. Imagine being able to build up one last match between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. Some of those legends who were around during the period that Bret was in the mid to late 90s in WWE, Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, people like that, I mean, they, in some cases, had some of the best matches of their career in those later years. Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. The funny thing is, that match they had at WrestleMania 25, which is my favorite Mania match, that's the match that gave Bret the itch to come back and want to work with WWE again. He watched that same match and just thought it was amazing. And that's really where things got going as far as a potential return to WWE, which did happen less than a year later. If Undertaker and Shawn Michaels at that age can go out there in 2009 and have a classic back-to-back, at WrestleMania like that. You don't think Bret Hart coming back to the company in 2002, 2003, 2005 couldn't have had some classic matches with Shawn Michaels? I mean, that would have been a given. A match with Kurt Angle or a whole series of matches with Kurt Angle, that would have been a must. Unfortunately, it's one of those what ifs. 12 years ago this week, on December 14, 2008, Jeff Hardy won his first WWE Championship at Armageddon in a triple threat match against Triple H and Edge. He was originally scheduled to challenge for the title at Survivor Series against Triple H and Vladimir Kozlov. Vladimir Kozlov wrestling for the WWE title. No wonder they wanted to make that a triple threat match and get that third person into that match. That third person turned out to be Edge. After Jeff Hardy in storyline was found passed out in a stairwell, Edge won the title, and a month later, Jeff realized his dream. Jeff Hardy, for people who may have forgotten, or for people who were not fans during that period, I don't think I can adequately explain how popular Jeff Hardy really was for that period of time. I mean, Jeff has always been popular, but there was a period of time in 2007 into the beginning of 2008, and even after he came back from the suspension in 2008, where this guy was red hot. I mean, he was the most over guy in wrestling. I would say comparable even to John Cena. The air was let out of the building inside Madison Square Garden that year at the Royal Rumble when he lost to Randy Orton. Jeff was super over. Now, in hindsight, it's a good thing they didn't put the title on him at the Rumble that night because he ended up getting suspended right before WrestleMania, and that was his second violation of the wellness policy. So he was suspended for 60 days and missed WrestleMania. Now imagine if he was WWE champion. But now here finally at Armageddon at the end of the year, he's the champion. The celebration, though, would be short-lived. It would not last very long because the following month at the Royal Rumble, he dropped the title right back to Edge when his brother, his own flesh and blood, came down during the match. It was a no DQ match, and he pasted Jeff Hardy in the head with that chair. This was a spot originally reserved for Christian. Christian was making his return to the company. And that was going to be the spot. He was going to interfere. He was going to attack Jeff Hardy, start a feud with him. But then word leaked out online. And Vince McMahon blew a gasket. And so he changed it. He wanted to swerve everybody. And he changed it to Matt Hardy instead. And they sent Christian to ECW Purgatory. The guy didn't do anything wrong. Ends up being sent to ECW. And what a storyline, by the way, this Hardy storyline. What a storyline this turned out to be. With Matt Hardy suggesting that he was the one who burned down Jeff's home the previous year, which really happened, by the way. That was a real thing that happened. Not Matt burning his home down, I hope. But Jeff's house did burn down. He was living in a trailer at the time. I think it was like a double-wide trailer at the time. This, I believe, was during that period where he was suspended for those 60 days. I think he was out getting a tattoo somewhere. Thankfully, he wasn't home. Might have been an electrical fire. And his trailer burned down along with his dog, Jack. His dog burned up in the fire as well. So WWE, of course, decided to incorporate that into their storyline. So Matt Hardy did not just burn down his brother's home. He killed his dog, too. WWE does not have a very good track record when it comes to pooches. The Islanders kidnapped Matilda. The big boss man turned Al Snow's dog into pepper steak and then fed it to him. Triple H's bulldog, remember that? The build-up to WrestleMania 18. Lucy the bulldog was run over by a limo on the go-home Raw to WrestleMania. That tells you all you need to know about the way they booked Chris Jericho as the undisputed champion. And here Matt Hardy made s'mores out of his brother's dog. 8 years ago this week, On December 16th, 2012, WWE held what I believe is one of the better TLC pay-per-views that they have ever done. And I may be a little bit biased because I was in attendance at this show. The very first WWE pay-per-view ever held at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York. Their first ever pay-per-view at all in Brooklyn. And what would a Brooklyn pay-per-view be without an appearance by the Brooklyn Brawler, who teamed up with Alberto Del Rio and The Miz in a win over 3MB. The Brawler and Heath Slater are the only two wrestlers in that match to not be a world champion in their career. Every other man in that match either was or would go on to be a world champion in WWE. And I think, I'm not counting Heath Slater if he was a champion in developmental or something. You know what I mean. I'm not counting that. Dolph Ziggler headlined his first WWE pay-per-view and retained his Money in the Bank briefcase in a ladder match against John Cena. Still to this day, one of the biggest matches, I guess, looking back. It was, I don't know if it was the biggest, but one of the biggest matches and nights of his career. AJ Lee skipped on down to the ring and she pushed the ladder over with John Cena on it. She turned heel and aligned herself with Dolph that night, helped him win the match. Excellent match, by the way. But this pay-per-view was all about the Shield. This was the in-ring debut for Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Roman Reigns in a TLC match against Daniel Bryan, Ryback, and Kane. And I think I had this as my match of the year for 2012. It was either this or it may have been the Extreme Rules match. Brock Lesnar's first match back against John Cena. But these were the two best matches, in my opinion, the two best matches all year in WWE. And they had some great matches in 2012, but those were my two favorites. This was an outstanding match. And it was a huge win for the Shield. They put the new guys over strong. This is how you get new talent over. I will not ever forget that giant ladder bump that Seth Rollins took during that match. But what a great match this was. 7 years ago, on December 16th, 2013, after 11 years in TNA wrestling, AJ Styles, he was like the Sting of TNA. He was the heart and soul. He was the franchise player of that organization. And he became a free agent. When his contract expired, the two sides were negotiating for a while. They were unable to come to a new deal. AJ ended up in Ring of Honor and also signed a deal with New Japan Pro Wrestling the following year, where he immediately joined Bullet Club. And in his very first match, 1 month after he debuted in New Japan, he wrestled Okada and he beat him and he became the IWGP Heavyweight Champion. Now, Styles says the reason he left TNA is because they wanted him to do the same amount of work, but for less money. In an interview with Title Match Wrestling 2 years ago, he suggested that it was at least a 60% pay cut from what he was making previously. He said, everybody thinks that we make millions of dollars. That's not how it works. Well, now it is. I mean, I'm sure AJ is making, he's probably making a few million now. But anyway, he says, everybody thinks we make millions of dollars. That's not how this works. That's not what we do. You have to pay your agent. You have to pay to be on the road. You've got to pay your taxes. The reality is that it's not as much as people think. I'm not about to take a pay cut after everything that I've done. Because TNA mismanaged their money, I have to pay the price. That's not how it works, and I will not take a backhanded slap like that. And I am still amazed, pleasantly surprised and amazed at the level of success that AJ Styles has had since coming over to WWE. Not that he couldn't have the kinds of matches that we've seen him have. You know the kind of athlete he is. You know what this guy is capable of in the ring. You've had people like The Undertaker turn around and say, man, if I wish you would have been in this company 10 years earlier. You and I could have made a lot of money and had a lot of fun. And you could fantasy book tons of matches if AJ had come to WWE, maybe not even 10 years, but even 5 years earlier than he did. But you know, at the time, to think that this guy, Mr. TNA, was going to come in and from day one get the kind of big push that he got it's amazing. Because that didn't happen with a lot of talent that came over from TNA at that time. But from really the first day that he came in, he was treated as an equal. He was treated like a main event player. He got a whole bunch of wins over John Cena. Less than a year later, he was the champion. And 2 years ago this week, on December 18, 2018, I already talked about this earlier in the podcast, but Vince McMahon appeared on Raw with the rest of his family and admitted on live television that they were not doing a very good job for their audience. They admitted basically that their show sucked. They didn't have the courage to actually say it that way and use that word, so I'll use it for them. It sucked. Raw sucked. And they promised changes, not just to Raw, but to SmackDown as well, because the McMahons are now going to take back control of both shows. It's funny, I never knew they left. I never knew they ceded control. In storyline, they blamed other people for the quality of the shows, including Baron Corbin, which, I mean, they're not wrong. They promised new faces. They promised fresh matchups in the months to come. And Triple H told us, the fans, that we are now the authority. They did that so that they could turn around and blame all of us when the product didn't get any better, which it did not. And here we are 2 years later, with Raw setting new record lows with no end in sight. No matter how many Band-Aids they put on that gunshot wound, eventually the patient bleeds to death. And that is this week in wrestling history.